I'm Deepak Chopra. I'm with Rupert Sheldrake at his home in England, in Hampstead. And in this segment, we're going to discuss his book, Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery. And this is, in many ways, a very iconoclastic manuscript in that it creates new insights into what we normally take for granted. And Rupert, in this book, you have addressed a lot of assumptions that most of us make when we think of science. And science is currently regarded as the most valid way of understanding what we call reality. So I'd like to go through these 10 assumptions that you question in your book. The first assumption is everything is essentially mechanical. Dogs, for example, are complex mechanisms rather than living organisms with goals of their own. Even people are machines, lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase. I would think he is definitely a lumbering robot, so there are exceptions to the rule, and that we are all genetically programmed computers. And you question that.
Well, this is the foundational assumption of science since the 17th century. And we're talking about something built into the foundation of science as we know it as an assumption. Nature's a machine. The universe, at first, they thought was like clockwork. You know, the heart's a pump, the eye's like a camera. This is a metaphor. It's not a theory. It's not even a testable theory. It's simply a metaphor about nature. And like any metaphor, it's valuable up to a point. But when it's taken to be the truth about nature, then it becomes a very limiting assumption. And it's very questionable that animals and plants are just machines. First of all, they're not like any machine we actually know. And secondly, animals behave in ways that are completely unmechanical. They have goals. Machines don't in themselves have a goal. If you get in a car, it doesn't have a goal as to where it wants to go. It does what you want it to do. On the other hand, organisms have their own goals. If you get on a horse, it might have its own idea about where it wants to go.
Every biological organism is goal-oriented.
It's goal-oriented. I mean, an oak seedling is trying to grow into an oak tree, and if you block its passage, it'll struggle to get there some other way. A hungry dog trying to get to a bone will strain at the leash to get to the bone, and you can actually measure the force of its goal orientation. It's heading towards that bone, or a bitch on heat.
So what you're saying is that nature is not machine-like, it's what, mind-like?
It's organism-like. Mm-hmm. So I think a much better word is organism. I mean, I'm taking the radical view that living organisms are living organisms, not machines. They're just what they seem, what most people would think they are.
But you're suggesting all of nature is like that.
Yes, I think the whole universe is like an organism. I mean, it's born small in the Big Bang. It's like the hatching of the cosmic egg. And after that it grows, and as it grows, new forms and structures appear within it. That's like a developing plant or animal. It's not like any machine we know. No computer, no car is born small, very, very small, and then grows.
It's recursive. It recreates itself as well.
Well, things within the universe recreate themselves, animals and plants, so, new generations.
And then new forms arise.
Yes.
And there's feedback.
Yes, so organisms are a much better metaphor for the universe than machine. And if we take the view that it's an organism, we have the view that essentially it's alive, not dead.
Second assumption, you say, all matter is unconscious. It has no inner life or subjectivity or point of view. Even human consciousness is an illusion produced by the material activities of brains. So, talk about that.
Well, again, the assumption that matter's unconscious was built into science in the 17th century. We're dealing here with a baggage that comes from far in the past, when science was at a very undeveloped stage. And that assumption was made by René Descartes, the French philosopher. And he made a sharp division. He said, consciousness exists, and there's three kinds of consciousness. There's God, there's angels, and there's human consciousness. But everything else in nature is made of matter, and matter's unconscious. So this is called Cartesian dualism, the split between mind and matter. In the 19th, most scientists went along with that, because you could go on having God, you could go on believing you were free and responsible, and the rest of nature was a machine. It also meant we're the only ones with consciousness and purposes, and therefore animals are just machines, so we can grow them in factory farms and genetically engineer them and treat them as inanimate, essentially. So here we have this view that created a tremendous split. In the 19th century, more and more people got fed up with this split. They didn't like it, and they said, well, no, the best way we can deal with this is to say instead of two things, there's just one thing, matter. And that's materialism. It arises by saying, no, there's no such thing as God and angels, and that fitted with the kind of atheist agenda that many of these scientists had. And then human consciousness is the only thing left, and so now you've got to explain that as nothing but the activity of the brain. The problem is that this leads to what's in the philosophy of mind called the hard problem, because it basically means consciousness ought not to exist anywhere in the universe, even in us. So a lot of philosophers have spent their entire careers trying to prove that we're not conscious,
Yes.
or that consciousness does nothing. It may exist, but it does nothing. It's like a kind of phosphorescence around the nerve endings that doesn't actually do anything. So this is the hard problem, and the assumption that all of nature is unconscious is not proved by science. It's just been assumed since the 17th century. And it's a very limiting assumption, and it's obvious to anyone who's kept a dog that dogs have minds and feelings and consciousness, and cats have them, and so do many other animals. And some would say that the whole of Gaia, the planet, is a living organism, possibly with a mind. Some people would even go so far as to say the sun's conscious, or the galaxy. They may have minds as well as just bodies. I think that's a much more interesting view of nature, and there's nothing in science that prevents us thinking that way.
You know, I was in a debate with Richard Dawkins recently, and I quoted Freeman Dyson from his book, Infinity in All Directions. And in the book, Freeman actually points to this idea that consciousness pervades the universe from atom to galaxy. Dawkins first said that couldn't be possible, and that Freeman Dyson should sue me. So actually I wrote a letter to Freeman Dyson, and Dr. Dawkins suggests you should sue me because I quoted you as follows. And Freeman Dyson wrote back with a beautiful short note, and he said, first of all, I have no desire to sue anyone, but three mysteries have confounded me all my life. The first is the unpredictable movement of atoms. He didn't use the word random, he said unpredictable, fine distinction. The second is our own consciousness, and the third is a universe that is hospitable to life. He said, I don't know the answer to these three questions, but they seem to be connected to each other. And, we sent the email to Dawkins, who politely suggested that I take him off this communication. But here's Freeman Dyson, one of the most prominent physicists of all time, yes, who says that every quantum experiment forces the atom to make a choice in the realm of quantum uncertainty.
Yes.
Suggests that, we do have free will, and that consciousness is everywhere in the universe, as you suggested just now. Your the third assumption that you question, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, with the exception of the Big Bang, when all the matter and energy of the universe suddenly appeared. You are questioning one of the most fundamental laws of nature.
Yes.
The law of conservation of energy, right?
This was built into science originally on theological grounds. In the 17th century, scientists assumed that God created the universe in the first place. He created a fixed number of atoms of matter which couldn't be destroyed by definition. So the total amount of matter was the same thereafter, and he imposed movement on the universe, and because it was God-given, the total amount couldn't change. So basically the assumptions were philosophical or theological in the first place. They were codified in the 19th century to be the first law of thermodynamics, the law of conservation of energy. And they've become part of science as we know it. But are they absolute truths? They're accounting principles that work quite well. But physics itself has now moved beyond them, because in modern cosmology they find that they can't explain galaxies and the way they work and attract each other on the basis of known amounts of matter. So they've invented or hypothesized about 5 times more matter than is actually observed. It's called dark matter because you can't see it. That means the universe is much more gravitationally pulling itself together, and it's got more mass. It would pull itself together. It ought to be slowing down instead of as it expands because of all this extra matter. It turns out in the last 10 years it's become apparent it's actually speeding up. So how do you explain it speeding up? Then there has to be extra energy, dark energy, to explain the universe expanding. And as the universe expands, there's more dark energy. The universe is now a perpetual motion machine, and dark matter and dark energy make up 96% of reality.
So you're saying that dark energy and dark matter are basically metaphysical concepts to keep the equations the same, that basically the standard model is just a compromise?
Well, I'm saying that they've been invented to explain the facts. And you change the amount of dark matter and dark energy to make the equations balance. There's no independent evidence for them. People have been looking for it.
Yeah,
for
well,
a long time.
now there's a kind of a hypothesized particle called a WIMP.
Yes, there's
the
hypothetical particles to explain it, but no one's found a WIMP. So we've now got 96% of reality that's utterly unknown to physics. And how can we say the total amount of matter and energy is always the same when they keep changing the total amount at will?
In fact, I believe the cosmological constant, which is dark energy, the measured value is totally out of line with the standard model.
Yes.
So what's your alternative? The matter is being produced and...
Well, I don't know. I think that we're in a realm where we just don't know. And
where was all this stuff before the Big Bang?
well, exactly. We don't know that either, you see. And so there's also the 0 point energy field in quantum physics,
Correct.
a spoonful of which would be enough to power the world for years because it has all this energy. Can that energy be converted into ordinary energy? If so, could alternative energy technologies be possible? All these, to my mind, are open questions.
Correct.
But they're not open questions if you take 19th century physics as the only possible framework for science.
Correct. Now on assumption 4, which we have addressed elsewhere, but let's do it again here, just a short answer to this. The laws of nature are fixed. They are the same today as they were at the beginning. They will stay the same forever.
Just an assumption, and until 1966, when the Big Bang theory became orthodox, most scientists thought the universe was eternal. Eternal laws, eternal matter, eternal energy fitted together. However, if the universe begins 14 billion years ago, were all the laws of nature there at the beginning, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? And if so, where did they come from? And how could you prove they were all there? If the universe is evolutionary, why shouldn't the laws evolve too? After all, human laws evolve. That's the basis of the law metaphor. I think, in fact, they're much more like habits maintained by what I call morphic resonance. This is a view that philosophers have proposed, other scientists have proposed, and Lee Smolin, the physicist, suggests that the laws of nature are more like habits. And I think it makes a lot more sense of the way the world is than to assume that they were all there exactly right at the very beginning. It's just an assumption. It's a kind of hangover from an older world view.
So when we say laws, we're talking about regularities in nature and patterns in nature. I think in the book you suggest that even the cosmological constants have been revised periodically.
Yes. I mean, the word law in science can mean just a description of an observed regularity. Now, if that's the case, the laws have obviously changed because the regularities of nature are different today when we've got plants and animals from what they were soon after the Big Bang, when it was billions of degrees centigrade. Different things happened then. But most scientists are implicit, physicists anyway, are implicit Platonists. They believe that the ultimate reality is mathematical. There's a kind of mathematical world beyond this world, a transcendent realm of mathematical equations, and that's the true reality. They think that doesn't change, and that was there governing the universe at the moment of the Big Bang. So in that sense, that's the way they think laws are eternal. But that's a big metaphysical assumption. It's almost a kind of religious assumption. And if we take laws as just being descriptions, then certainly they evolve, and there's no reason to assume they're fixed.
I have a question here, which may not be directly related to this. You know, we say that the Big Bang happened 13.8 billion years ago. Of course, we're speaking of how we measure time as human beings on planet Earth. But even then, how do we give a datable event to something that happened when there was no time? It sounds kind of strange to me.
Well, it is strange, and it's of course an assumption as well, because to work out that the Big Bang happened at that time, what you do is take the universe as it is now, it's expanding. You assume all the laws are the same right from the beginning, and then you crank back the whole universe, and you know it's big now, so it must have been small. You keep going until you get back till it's absolutely, it can't get any smaller, and you say, okay, that's the beginning, the Big Bang. But the whole of the Big Bang theory depends on assuming all the laws are completely constant way back to the beginning. Then you have the initial singularity, as it's called.
But when you get to the Planck epoch, then there are no laws left anymore.
No, well, they assume that they are, because most physicists assume that maths exists in a Platonic transcendent realm.
I see. Nature is purposeless, and evolution has no goal or direction.
Machines have no purposes of their own, so if the universe is a machine and everything in it is a machine, it can't have any purposes. Then it's a problem to explain how we have purposes and how animals obviously have purposes and plants have them. That becomes difficult to explain. So they then say, well, you can't talk about purpose. You can talk about selective advantage of behavior that gives... They try and explain it in terms of Darwinian natural selection, a purposeless process. But the assumption that the whole of evolution has no purpose is not proved. It's simply an assumption. If the universe is a machine and machines have no purpose, nature has no purpose. It follows from a metaphor. It's an extension of a metaphor, untested and usually undiscussed within science. And if the universe isn't a machine, if it's an organism, why shouldn't it? The whole universe have a purpose. Organisms have purposes. So here we have something that's pure assumption, not based on evidence, not based on careful experimentation.
And yet, you know, when we talk about people like Lamarck or the whole idea of teleology, that's kind of ridiculed by people like Dennett and others.
Yes, because since the 17th century there's been a taboo in science against teleology, the study of purpose, because nature is supposed to be purposeless, as a dogmatic assumption. In fact, you can't get away from purpose. We're obviously purposive, and Dennett himself says that the best way to understand animals is through what he calls the intentional stance, which means you treat them as if they have purposes. So it's okay, we can go on talking about purposes. Selfish genes have purposes to reproduce themselves. Then you say, well, wait a minute, they're not meant to have purposes at all. They say, oh no, we're just saying it's as if they have purposes. So they're basically saying they don't have purposes, but let's pretend they do, because that's the way we understand things. So this whole pretense is so unnecessary if you drop the silly assumption.
So purpose implies intelligence or not?
Not necessarily. It could just imply a goal, and a goal could be unconscious. You could say, in a sense, when you drop something, it falls towards the earth. It's the gravitational pull creates a kind of goal for a stone falling to the earth. But that would not be a conscious purpose. So there can be conscious purposes, but I think there can be many unconscious purposes. And one of the things that psychotherapists do is uncover the unconscious purposes that govern many people's behavior.
You know, I was at a conference recently where somebody suggested that what we call the unconscious is really the realm of non-local mind and is more awake than our so-called conscious mind.
Some could call that, some might call it the superconscious. I mean, I think part of the unconscious is a kind of collective habits or memories, which Jung thought it was. But I think there can be a creative aspect to the collective mind as well. And they may be collapsing them both into the word unconscious may be a bit misleading.
You know, in the tradition I come from, the unconscious mind never sleeps, and it is one of the purposes of the yogi is to wake up to that unconscious mind and literally be more awake, in a sense, in the direction of what we call enlightenment, as nothing is left in the realm of the unconscious, that it is the conscious, and our conscious mind is just the crest of the wave of the ocean of consciousness. Assumption 6. All biological inheritance is material, carried in the genetic material DNA and in all other material structures. So inheritance is mostly, you're saying, not genetic at all.
No, it used to be assumed it was all in the genes, or practically all in the genes, with a bit of cytoplasmic inheritance. Then it turned out that, as a result of the Human Genome Project, that genes don't explain most forms of inheritance. They explain 5 or 10% of most phenomena. There's a few cases where a single gene can explain a single hereditary disease. A few cases, cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, I'm told that 5% of disease-related gene mutations are fully penetrant, 95% aren't. Yeah.
That's right. So the thing is that for most things, it turns out it only explains about 5 to 10% of inheritance, instead of 80 or 90%. So the missing inheritance that the genes aren't explaining is now called within biology the missing heritability problem. It's not explained by genes. I think it's explained largely by morphic resonance, a kind of transfer of memory. And so I think that the idea, and epigenetic inheritance has now become acceptable in biology. It was the biggest taboo in the 20th century, the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Every biology student was taught this is heresy, it doesn't happen, it's ridiculous, you can't even mention it, etc. It's now been rehabilitated under the name epigenetic inheritance, and it's leading to exciting new discoveries within science. But all of these have caused the original, genes giving characteristics, one gene, one characteristic, that kind of view is now extremely naive, and very few people would actually believe that. It's become much more complex, and so I think the role of genes and even material components alone is now highly questionable in heredity.
I was talking to my colleague and friend Rudy Tanzi, who has the genetic laboratory at Harvard Medical School at Mass General Hospital. And he was saying that every experience we have, and even how we interpret the experience, influences genetic activity. And that's epigenetics now has to take into account experience as being metabolized literally into biological phenomenon.
Yes.
And you're saying that not only does it get metabolized into biological phenomenon, but it stays somewhere in the realm of this morphic field, so it's transferred to the next generation.
Yes.
Minds are inside heads and are nothing but activities of brains. When you look at a tree, the image of the tree you're seeing is not out there where it seems to be, but inside your brain. So where is the image?
Well, I think the image is where it seems to be. I think my image of you right now is where you are. That I think that in vision, light comes in, changes happen in the brain, which have been described in more detail than ever before by brain scanning and so on. But the image, I don't think is inside the head. I don't think there's a miniaturized Deepak somewhere inside my brain in a virtual reality display produced by nervous tissue. That's the usual assumption, it's all inside the head. I think that my image of you is projected out to where you are. Now sometimes you project images when things aren't there, then it's a hallucination or an illusion. But normally they correspond with where things are. And I think that the extended mind, the mind extended beyond the brain, is the basis of all our normal everyday experience. When I look at a tree, the image of the tree is out there. There's an invisible projection of my mind. When I look at a star, my mind literally extends over astronomical distances to contact that star. So I think the idea it's all inside the brain is an exceedingly naive assumption. And it doesn't correspond with our experience
Isn't
either.
this the essence of the hard problem? What comes to my eyes from there is a photon. The photon has no mass.
Yes.
It has no energy. It's dimensionless. Sends an electrical current to my brain. There's electrochemistry. But I experience a tree. I experience a three-dimensional world in space and time. I look at stars and galaxies. How do these photons become that, or do they? Or is it, as you say, a projection of consciousness from what we might call perceptual space or cognitive space, and we actually don't know where that is?
Well, I think it's a projection of consciousness, and I do think it's projected out rather than being in some virtual realm.
Mm-hmm.
And this can be tested, and that's why I've done a lot of experiments on this, that if you look at somebody from behind, if your mind in a sense reaches out to touch them, they might be able to feel you looking at them, and indeed people do seem to be able to feel when they're being stared at, and so do animals. There's good evidence for that being a real phenomenon.
I was talking to another physicist, and he said that for that photon that's coming from a distant galaxy to my eyes right now, and what I'm looking at is presumably something that existed millions of light years ago, but for that photon, because it's traveling at the speed of light, no time has transpired. I'm instantly in contact with that galaxy.
Yes.
Where?
Well, exactly. I think that we're interlinked with the whole of the universe through, mainly through our visual sense, but also through our hearing. I think our minds extend out throughout the universe, and with modern telescopes which enable us to see galaxies beyond our own, and with microscopes that penetrate to the very heart of matter, I think our minds, through scientific discovery, are literally reaching out into the realms of the universe, of the very large and the very small. And if beings in other galaxies that were not known about till the 20th century were sensitive enough, I think they might suddenly feel something change as human consciousness reached them, as they became within human consciousness, as it were, the sense of being stared at by humans, the awareness that something else is looking at them.
Mm-hmm. Memories are stored as material traces in the brain and are wiped out at death. But if we agree with your model of morphic resonance, memories recycle themselves as biological organisms, literally.
Yes. The assumption there in the brain, you see, is one of the foundational assumptions of neuroscience. It's just an assumption. No one's actually found a memory in a brain. They've tried terribly hard to find them for over 100 years, and they've been extraordinarily elusive. I think they're very elusive because they're not there. I think they're not there in the same sense that if I analyse your TV set to see what you watched yesterday on TV, I'm not going to find traces in the wires and transistors of yesterday's programs. So I think the brain is more like that, tuning into things. I don't think it's storing these memories. And so the assumption that they're all inside the brain is just that, an assumption. The evidence for it is extremely weak. And it makes more sense of the data to think that the brain isn't storing
We are
memory.
the recycling of cosmic memory then.
Well, we are the recycling of memories, of human memories specifically, but we also have the memories of past ancestral species and the behavior of animals in relation to day and night and plants and so on. Mm-hmm. We inherit a huge amount of collective memory. And when we die, whatever may happen to our individual consciousness, the kinds of habits and thoughts we've had re-enter the kind of collective human memory and will influence future generations.
Yeah. A little while ago I was with Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, and he was doing some calligraphy, and as he's drawing a circle, he said, I invite my mother to draw this circle with me. And he said, I invite my father to draw this circle with me. Then he invited all his human ancestors to draw the circle with him, and his animal ancestors, and on to the beginning of the first living organisms. And I realized in a sense that our genetic activity is indeed all our ancestors active in every moment of our lives, this moment.
Yes.
And their memories and their experiences.
Yes.
Unexplained phenomena such as telepathy are illusory. Now you've done a lot of work on this. These are dormant potentials in all of us? even in animals?
I think they're more than dormant. I think they're commonly expressed in animals. I think telepathy is very common in animals, and I think it's a normal means of communication between members of animal groups. I think that they're all bonded together through what I call the morphic field of the group. And even when some animals go away, wolves go hunting, they leave the cubs in the den, they still remain connected through this field, so a change in one can affect the other. The medium of transmission is the field itself, and this is what we'd call telepathy. So I've done a lot of research on this in animals, because I think if it occurs in humans, it occurs in animals. It's normal, not paranormal, natural, not supernatural. I did a lot of research on dogs that know when their owners are coming home. And even when people come home at unusual times, by unusual methods, many dogs still know when they're coming and start waiting for them 20 minutes, half an hour in advance. We've done lots of this research. In the human realm, telepathy happens most commonly in connection with phone calls. People think of someone who then rings and you say, it's funny, I was just thinking about you.
What about bird migrations, or the migrations of, say, monarch butterflies, who a generation later come back to the same place?
Well, I think that's more to do with collective memory than telepathy. Telepathy, by definition, occurs immediately, now.
Okay.
And so a dog knows when you're coming home, when you're coming home. If it was remembering, it would be going to the door all the time, remembering yesterday or the day before.
Right.
So it's immediate. So I think that the minds also, we tune into memories, and I think there's some evidence we can pick up things that haven't yet happened, precognitions, presentiments. All of this is banned by the conventional scientific assumption that the mind's nothing but the brain, because none of these things ought to happen. And so some scientists and so-called skeptics say, well, they don't happen because we can't explain them. They ought not to happen, therefore they don't happen, and all this evidence is invalid. Now that's a very narrow dogmatic position, and as we move on from that, I think what we find is there's a huge realm that can be explored experimentally that will enormously enlarge our understanding of animal and human nature.
I tend to think of our current skeptics as actually pseudo-skeptics. You and I are radical skeptics. They question the primacy of consciousness,
Yes.
and we question the existence of matter.
Well, I agree. I think they pretend to be skeptics. Skepticism itself is good. And you're a skeptic, I'm a skeptic. But they label themselves skeptics in order to defend a materialist point of view by attacking anything else.
Well, your last point, mechanistic medicine is the only kind of reality that works. That's something right up my alley. I've questioned that for the last 30 years, and now we are seeing actually with epigenetics and how consciousness influences gene behavior, and we've been doing experiments now that we are publishing, that mechanistic medicine may work for acute emergencies like pneumonia or breaking a leg or appendicitis, but as far as chronic illness is concerned, all kinds of chronic illness, there are much healthier approaches that include simple things like sleep and stress management and meditation and diet and the quality of awareness.
Yes.
And even personal relationships and social interactions. So you've questioned that here.
Well, it's just one of the 10 assumptions, the default standard assumptions. And I mean, I completely agree with you about that. And I myself think that it's really the medical world that's going to drive paradigm change for economic reasons. The present systems are unsustainable and they're breaking down. And it's going to force a change. Some of these other areas seem a bit theoretical and abstract for most people, and they're not top of their list, but health and well-being are top of most people's list of concerns, or very high. And anything that can make health delivery systems work better, enable people to live healthier and happier lives, is going to trump a dogmatic scientific system that says, no, you're only allowed to have certain kinds of medicine, drugs and surgery. You're not allowed to do anything else, or at least we're not going to pay for it. I think because many of these things are cheaper, they'll have to be adopted by things like the British National Health Service, and already to some extent they are. So I think this is really going to be a driving force, and that's why I think the kind of work you're doing is actually at the leading edge of paradigm change, because it's medicine.
So there we are with Dr. Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake. The book is Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery, questioning the dogmas of current contemporary science, which ultimately, as we explore the new paradigm, leads to a new kind of sense of being or identity of who we really are. We're not these physical machines that have learned how to think. We might be thoughts or consciousness that has learned how to make the so-called machine.
A completely different understanding of ourselves and of nature, and one that's, I think, happier and healthier.
Thank you.